It's recording now. Okay, so welcome to our unit on plagues in the ancient world. We are fortunate to have with us four friends, well, three friends and one husband. We have with us Bülent Arıkan from Turkey, and his wife Gonca Dardinez Arıkan, also from Turkey, but who was just recently here in Buffalo as a visiting scholar at the University of Buffalo. We also have with us Giulia Volluno, currently in Italy, who was here the entire last year, I think, and got to experience COVID firsthand here in the United States, and is currently in quarantine in Italy since she was finally able to go back. And we also have another Italian with us, Davide Salvo, who is my husband, and who's also here at Canisius College and working on finishing his second PhD. So if you'd like to each maybe talk a little bit about who you are and what you're going to talk about, and then we can move forward. Bülent, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the introduction, Richard. Yes, my name is Bülent Arıkan, and I'm an associate professor of archaeology. I'm currently at Istanbul Technical University, Eurasia Institute of Earth Sciences, and I'm mainly interested in climate change in the past and the past societies' adaptations to climate change, and also how they impacted their environment through farming and herding. So agriculture and pastoralist lifeways. And in terms of the impact of the COVID-19 disease, we have been dealing with this for a little more than 3 months now. And for the larger chunk of that period of time, the country was under a strict shutdown. That included colleges, all schools, and obviously non-essential service sector as well. We reopened June 1st, and the daily discoveries, the daily number of new cases was quite low, about 800s, 700s. But then it's going back up now. Today, I think, or yesterday, it was about 1,400. So it's on the rise again, but there's really no sign of another shutdown, honestly.
It sounds similar to the United States, where we have cases in some states going back up again. So I guess we'll have to see how this progresses. Gonca.
Hi again, I am Gonca Dardinez Arıkan, and now I'm the assistant professor in the Department of Archaeology in the Proto-History and Ancient Near Eastern Archaeology department. As Richard, you have mentioned, I was recently back from Buffalo. It was just before the outbreak of COVID-19, actually. I returned to Istanbul in the mid-January. Kind of before the outbreak. As Bülent briefly mentioned, the situation in Turkey is not super good, but not super bad either. So the numbers after the opening in the 1st of June, the numbers are again in the rise. So we are doubling, and everybody is waiting for a second wave. So we don't know how it is going to continue. And thinking in terms of Istanbul, I would like to mention the fact that it's a quite busy city of 15 million population, and 15 million, in order to make a better sense, is a sum of Greece, Belgium, and Holland. So it is a city of almost 3 countries. So the region is quite heavily populated. And now we are experiencing the summertime. Everybody would like to be outside. Nobody would like to wear masks, even though it's mandatory. So it is going to rise again. That's what we are waiting for.
I guess I didn't realize how densely populated Istanbul was. That's a challenge to try to control.
It's yeah, it's hard.
And Davide, I'm just going in order of how you're presenting. So
I am Davide Salvo, and I'm finishing up my PhD at SUNY at Buffalo, and I'm teaching at Canisius College. I live here in Buffalo, so I think we know how is the situation here. I mean, there was the New York State reopened, that was on Tuesday, the governor reopened on Tuesday, on June 16. So the situation seems better, but I think as in Turkey, we are waiting for probably the second wave of this COVID-19 to hit not only Buffalo, but all the United States. So that is. Also, I have some of my family, I'm originally from Italy. Some of my family is living in Italy, in southern Italy, in Sicily. And there the situation was pretty bad, even if Sicily was not hit badly as in the northern regions of Italy, Lombardy, Piedmont, but still they were under a very strict lockdown. So the situation was really, I will use the adjective dramatic. It was really tough, a tough lockdown. Probably Giulia, who is currently in Italy, can tell more about the situation in Italy.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. And my name is Giulia Volluno. And yeah, I'm an archaeologist specialized in the Middle Ages, in particularly on burial evidence, so funerary evidence, funerary remains that have helped me in my research to detect information about identity in the past, especially gender and ethnicity. I've just left Buffalo, where I have been in the past academic year, the postdoctoral associate of the Institute for European and Medieval and Mediterranean Archaeology at the University of Buffalo, SUNY. And so, yes, I've been in Italy now almost 2 weeks. It's been quite challenging to manage to come back, both to book flights. The flights have been constantly changing, the original scheduled and itinerary. So I had to take 4 flights and travel for 2 days to reach Rome. I would love to say more about Italian condition, but I'm actually quarantining now. So I basically went straight from the airport to the place where I'm quarantining alone, but it will be just a couple of days and then I will be out. And I will be able to see with my eyes what I've heard, that actually Italy, after a big decrease in cases in the last month or so, has been gradually reopening. And at the moment, almost everything is opened, restaurants, bars, hairdressers. So, but I feel, at least from my isolation and from the conversation I had with people outside, that the majority of the people is very aware that the problem is still there. They're trying to going back to a normal life, but with caution. So wearing masks, doing social distancing, and although there aren't any clear signs of another wave coming yet, it is in the back of the mind of everybody. So we start to going back to normal, but it's a new normal. At least is what I've heard is happening here, and what I think I will do when I will go out. Keep being careful.
Thank you all for the contemporary updates. So now let's turn to the ancient world and how plagues manifested and were dealt with throughout history. And I believe, Bülent, you are going to talk to us first about the beginning of settlement cultures and disease vectors.
Exactly. Yes, thank you. So when we talk about diseases, all right, and this is really a product of aggregated living, right? And so that's why I thought about starting with the beginning of the sedentism and how we actually transformed into settled life. And what you see here is actually a map of Eastern Mediterranean. Right, so this is the island of Cyprus, and this is really the end point of the Mediterranean Sea. So if you actually move west, then you will go through the island of Crete, and then you will reach mainland Greece first, and then Italy, and then all the way to the Iberian Peninsula, and then you would hit the Straits of Gibraltar before you sail into the Atlantic Ocean. So this is our area in Eastern Mediterranean, and what you see here is the Anatolian Peninsula. This is modern Turkey, bordered by Greece here, and Syria right south, and Iraq and Iran due east, and also further south, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, and further south is Egypt. So in this part of the world, in what we call basically Southwest Asia, to give the proper regional name, we are witnessing the major transformation from hunter-gatherer lifeways to settled life. And it really started at the end of the last ice age. We're calculating that the ice age ended about 10,000 years or 12,000 years ago, I'm sorry, 12,000 years ago. But really before that, the last hunter-gatherer groups were actually experimenting with settled lifestyles. So these are, as the name implies, hunter-gatherers. These were the groups that were roaming across the landscape. They would find nuts and fruits that they could gather, and they would hunt down large animals mainly that they could really easily kill and maybe take part of the meat for themselves. And for these people, what you see here are the stone tools that they frequently use. For these people, disease was actually not something of a common problem. One reason was that hunter-gatherer bands, we call them bands, a group of people that really did not exceed maybe 12 or 15. Hunter-gatherer bands were actually on the move continuously. And so this is not an aggregated lifestyle. They're roaming across the landscape continuously, and they are really not coming into contact with disease agents that frequently. Maybe common cold, yes, but other than that, there is really not much of an epigenetic factor that could affect these people. After the Kebaran culture of this region, the successing culture is the Natufian. And Natufians were important because this is actually the first time that people experimented with agriculture, okay, in the real sense of the word that we use today. So these are the very first farmers of Southwest Asia. And by the way, just as a footnote, agriculture, or as the famous British anthropologist Weir Gordon Childe called the Neolithic Revolution, we observed this change from hunter-gatherer lifestyle to food-producing economies. We observed this transformation in three regions in the old world. One is Southwest Asia. This is basically Mesopotamia, right here. And the second one is in China along the Yangtze River. And the third one is in India in the Indus Valley. So this is actually one of those three areas. And Natufians were important as a culture because, as I said, this was the first group that practiced agriculture. They were still hunter-gatherers, but when we look at their subsistence, it was maybe 60% from hunter-gatherer lifestyle and 40% from direct agricultural produce. And this is the point in time that we see a major change in settlement patterns. These people were becoming more and more sedentary. Now that they could actually produce a great deal of their own food, they started setting up permanent tents. First, those tents were less, mainly temporary structures, but in time, it started to become a more a more permanent solution to the problem of settling and finding a space in the landscape. Below what you see here is the food processing tools, such as a mortar and a pestle. This is also another tool that they basically use to process grain. They would basically gather wheat and barley and turn it into some sort of flour so that they could actually cook it and consume it. And at this point, really, we see the beginning of the Neolithic. And again, in this general map of Mesopotamia, we see the first Neolithic settlements in modern-day Israel here, in Jordan as well, and also in northern extremities of Mesopotamia. So this is the famous Fertile Crescent right here. And so in the northern extremities of Mesopotamian plain, this is the point where the floodplain of Euphrates and Tigris meets the Taurus mountain range. So this is actually receiving a lot of rain. And this is the place where we see those first villages. Okay, so this is an example of the Neolithic village at Jericho in Israel. This is the figurines, life-size, not the figurines, but life-size statues from another early Neolithic settlement at Ain Ghazal, right across Jericho on the other side of the Jordan River, this time in Jordan. And again, early villages in Anatolia, in the just north of the Fertile Crescent. This is the famous early Neolithic site of Çayönü from Turkey. And again, another famous settlement, Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia, close to Çayönü. And this time from central Anatolia, near the capital of the Turkish Republic, the Neolithic site of the Neolithic village of Çatalhöyük. The common aspect of these settlements is that people were living in larger groups when we compare them to the previous hunter-gatherers. And that seems to pose a significant threat. Now, when we talk about threat, it shouldn't mean that agriculture or agricultural lifeway was a threat. It's quite the contrary, because if we have a civilization today, we owe a huge chunk of that to the agricultural revolution and the urban revolution that ensued, that followed it. And in these villages, these are literally the villages in the sense of the word. In these villages, each household had a large structure. This is the main living area. All the food production happens here at the center of the living area, sleeping platforms along the edges, and right behind the living quarters is the storage space here as you see it. Or in a Çatalhöyük house, the organization, the internal organization is very similar to the one at Çayönü. So it doesn't matter where you go in ancient Mesopotamia, Neolithic houses and Neolithic way of life is just similar. They would just harvest the grain, store it year-round, and live it in closed quarters. And that brings a large group of people living together, because in time, population is increasing. How do we know this? We know about this population increase through public structures like this one at Jericho in Israel. This is actually a watchtower or a fortification wall and a defense tower. So about 9,000 or 10,000 years ago, these people were actually able to afford, able to build such monumental projects. And the way they were doing this was basically feeding population continuously, and we see the emergence of division of labor. But in that division of labor, actually, they carried the risk of getting sick, because when you put a lot of people in a limited amount of space, when you put them together with grain, when you put them together with food stuff, what happens is that, first of all, people will get sick and they will transmit the disease agent much more easily to the next person. And second, of course, food stuff would attract pests and especially mice. And that would actually introduce a larger risk, because protecting the food stuff from other animals seemed to be the most important and the hardest part of the Neolithic people in their daily lives. We know that they were actually covering the granaries with lime plaster so that it would keep actually off certain animals from the food stuff. When we talk about disease agents in the ancient, in the archaeological record, we really do not have much evidence for the earlier periods. That's to say, we do not really have evidence from 10,000 years ago or 9,000 years ago or even 6,000 years ago. It is hard because we are really at the beginning of ancient DNA research. This has been going on for some time, but it's mainly applied to human remains, and we're now just trying to understand the methodology of it, and we're more interested in documenting the mass movement of people rather than identifying the diseases at this stage. So it's at the ancient DNA research is really at its infancy for the time being. But we know that some diseases left their traces in human body. Okay, so although we cannot really find the direct remains of these diseases, we can actually identify them just by looking at the osteological remains of these people that lived several thousands of years ago. The first one is the vertebrae of a person infected with tuberculosis. And this is also a close-up of that vertebrae. So this is probably the most common disease that we can diagnose from these early populations, Neolithic, Chalcolithic, Copper Age populations. And the reason is that because tuberculosis leaves a very significant mark on bones, either on the vertebra or on the rib cage. Because it affects, as you all know, because it affects the lungs, it actually attacks bones near those lungs. Another disease that we can easily trace just by looking at the human skeletal material is syphilis. This skull belongs to a female that was infected with syphilis, and the skull, especially the frontal part of the skull, has been affected from this disease. And we know that people were transmitting these diseases frequently because they were, again, living in close quarters. There's really not much of a treatment for such diseases. And life expectancy is actually very short for early periods such as the Neolithic. This actually concludes my part, but before I hand it over to Gonca, who will talk about the following archaeological periods, I would like to mention just one aspect of disease and climate change, which is, I believe, very suitable for our time period. As we all know, climate changes, but there are different reasons for climate change. 6,000 years ago, climate was changing, okay? Climate was changing from a warmer and moister phase to a warmer and drier phase. We are actually still part of that change, but our modern change is mainly driven by anthropogenic events. 6,000 years ago, this change was all natural. But what we observe in the archaeological record is that once this change started to happen, and it happened over the course of a few centuries, really, very quick change, then it actually impacted societies in a very deliberate way. At the time that the climate change started about 6,000 years ago, people were actually transforming their landscape from villages to the first cities. So actually climate change caught them at a very abrupt phase in their lives, because the first cities were just about to emerge. People were just about to start living in much denser numbers. And when that climate change hit them, unfortunately, they didn't have all the resources they needed. We know, for example, in Southwest Asia, that most of these people didn't really have access to fresh water. So they couldn't actually irrigate their farms, but they also didn't have enough water for cleaning themselves. So this must have brought certain hygiene problems in these first cities. And this must have made their conditions far worse than before. So I'll just conclude my part, and I will hand it over to Gonca, who will talk about a case in Anatolia. So.
Thank you, Bulan, very much. That was very interesting. I've already learned so much. I think we'll do some questions and follow up after we hear from everyone. So Gonca, it is up to you now.
Oh, thank you, Richard. Now we are seeing Hattusha, the capital of the Hittite Empire. So we decided to continue with that slide so that you can see the extent of the cities. So it is not only cities are growing or villages are becoming cities, but there are also international relations in the following period, which we are saying the Bronze Ages. I would like to focus more on one certain occasion, which is known in the Hittite history as the epidemic in the Hittite Empire. And that is roughly 14th century BC. So I am taking you or traveling you back to almost 3,000, like 4,000 years ago. And we are hearing some textual records, and we are trying to understand either a recovery from an epidemic will take a generation or longer. So where is the Hittite Empire again? So Hittite Empire is established in the central Anatolia, and the capital city, Hattusha, is located very close to the modern capital of Turkish Republic. So what about the international or neighbors of the Hittite Empire? There we see the Egyptian dynasties, and here we have the Mycenaean Greece. There we have the, can you follow my pointer, by the way?
Yes.
So there is the Assyria and the Kassite kingdom, which we call Babylonia, and in the modern Iran, back at that time, we have the kingdom or empire of Elam. And in Hattusha, we have found almost 100 years ago plague tablets written in the form of cuneiform, and these tablets are also written in the language of Hittite, and the language of Hittite is the earliest known Indo-European language. That means it's a close relative of English, German, French, and Latin. So let's look at a little bit of the time of the epidemic, and we will focus a king called as where is my pointer? I don't know. So we are going to focus on a king called as Murshilli. So he lived in the late 14th century, early 13th century BC, and chronologically we are calling this period the Hittite Empire period. So that means Hittite Empire actually extend its borders south so that they can be in conflict with Egypt. So that is an important point, because now we can see how an epidemic can spread among the kingdoms of the second millennium BC. So these are the cuneiform tablets known in the Hittite archaeology as the plague prayers of Murshilli. If you can see from the tablet, it is written in cuneiform, and this tablet, which has 4 different copies, which 4 different prayers, is actually now in Istanbul archaeology museums. These tablets, which are where we learn about the plague in the Hittite Empire, is quite structured, where a king is trying to understand what was going wrong in his kingdom, and he's looking for the reasons, and he is also looking for a solution for this epidemic. So in this, at the beginning of these cuneiform tablets, the purpose of the prayers are stated, and they are asking their aim quite clearly, and the aim is trying to remove this epidemic from the kingdom. And by reading all these textual records, that we understand that it is not only the problem of the King Murshilli, but the problem is actually quite a long problem, which goes back to his father, Suppiluliuma I. And Murshilli, being a super religious king, which is a very common thing in the Hittite Empire, because the people of the Hittite people are quite religious themselves, they are looking of the issue of epidemic as a punishment of the gods. And that is the reason why the king is trying to dream, like trying to have some visions in his dreams, and trying to understand what the problem is, what the sin they have made, either himself or his father or his brothers, and seeks a reason for the plague. So this is one of the quite interesting writings or tablets where the King Murshilli is talking to the gods, and he is also giving us some idea about the duration of this epidemic. And he is saying, which I put as bold, you have let loose the plague in the interior of the land of Hatti. The land of Hatti is the Hittite Empire, today the central Anatolia. So there we learn the central Anatolia is completely under the influence or under the spread of this epidemic. And he is afraid and saying to the gods, behold, it is 20 years since people have been continually dying in the interior of Hatti. So what we learn is Murshilli himself is experiencing this problem for almost 20 years. So probably we are going to hear more from kind of ancient plagues in the later periods from Davide, but 20 years is almost a generation. It's quite a long time. If we are even thinking today's situation, we are under curfew or we are experiencing a pandemic for almost 3-4 months, and we already feel it quite long. And imagine 20 years, and of course, as the king, you have to look for some solutions. That is what the king of 4,000 years ago doing is the same. So, and what was the reason of the epidemic? What is the reality? What is the belief? Of course, the Hittites or the ancient societies have a limited understanding of the viruses and bacteria, which is expected. That is the reason why they actually look the issues as the punishment of the gods. And that is the same what Murshilli is also thinking. Please look at the red rectangle that I put here, where you see the Murshilli. Above Murshilli, you see Arnuanda, who is the brother of Murshilli, and above that you see the Shupililuma, who is the father of Murshilli. And both the brother of Murshilli and the father died because of this plague. That makes Murshilli very afraid of the situation, and probably he is expecting a similar kind of end for himself as well. So he turned himself to the gods, and he would like to try to placate the gods through rituals, prayers, and offerings. So Murshilli, the king himself, is looking at the issue as from the perspective of the God's punishment, but actually there is a real reason why Hittite Empire got this epidemic. So the king Shupililuma I decided to invade Egypt. They have a border conflict with Egypt, and remember again, I'll just take you a little bit back. Remember where the Egypt is, so where the borders of the Hittite Empire is. So this zone, which is the Levant, probably modern Lebanon, somewhere modern Lebanon today, they had a conflict. The Hittites and the Egyptians have a conflict because of the borders. So they battled. Hittites won, and the consequence of that is Hittites took back a lot of captives to central Anatolia, the Egyptian captives from Lebanon. And it is apparent from the other textual records that this epidemic first broke out among those captives. Probably back at that time, the Egypt is experiencing such a plague that is also known from the Egyptian textual records as well. So actually, international relations back at that time are helping the viruses to spread among the regions as well. So the Hatti won and took many captives back to the Hittite capital and central Anatolia, and of course those captives transferred or contagiously transferred this epidemic to the Hittite population as well. And Murshilli doesn't see the situation in this regard, and he's trying to look at other options, and the options is related to some family problems. What happens is Shupililuma, his father, killed his stepbrother in order to ascend to the throne of the Hittite kingdom, which is a no-no in the Hittite Empire. And that is why Murshilli thinks the gods are very afraid with the kingship, and that's why they are punishing for the Shupililuma's family for a generation. Another thing that comes to the visions of the Murshilli is Hatti broke a treaty with Egypt and invaded Egypt's territory. Before Shupililuma invaded Egypt, actually the kings before Shupililuma made a treaty with the Egyptian pharaohs saying that we are brothers and sisters, we are not going to kill each other. But Shupililuma, he would like to be the big king. That's why went to Egypt, and he brought back not only the victory, but also the epidemic. So since treaties are signed under the witnessing of the gods, which might be the reason, according to the Murshilli, to take the anger of the gods. And so this situation is going on, and Murshilli continuously asks for prayers, asks for offerings, asks for rituals, and half of the rituals include salt and water. So they are cleaning themselves, they are sacrificing animals in order to get rid of this epidemic. And at one point, we see Murshilli getting very bored and threatening the gods, saying that, listen, gods, you won't even have anyone left to bake bread for offerings or pour you libations if you don't remove the plague from Hatti. So he says, if you do not clean this epidemic from our land, we will all be dead and nobody would like to remember you as God. So act on it and remove the plague from our land. So I would like to bring all these religious and social aspects to you a little bit so that we can also maybe relate it to our modern vision of how we are looking at the epidemics, because from the Turkish perspective, I can clearly say we still sometimes, like some of the population still thinks that this is a godly punishment, or humans invaded too much of the nature. That is how nature is punishing the populations now. So this is an interesting aspect from looking the issue of epidemics. So there is also another hypothesis on the Hittite plague, because we cannot be sure either we can call it a plague or not. In the Hittite archaeology, unfortunately, we do not have that much of burials or skeletal remains, because Hittites are cremating their bodies. So there is unfortunately no option for us to go to the skeletal remains and look for the ancient DNA. Unfortunately, one day, if we can find a burial or cemetery, something like this, we can do that. But by looking at the symptoms, there is also the option of tularemia proposed instead of the Hittite plague. And there is a debate between the archaeologists and between the bioanthropologists what kind of a disease is that, and this is like continuing. And I also put all the information and related articles in for your Google folder. So if you are interested in reading further on this aspect, you can go to the links that I send you through, Richard. And this is an epidemic before 4,000 years ago, and it at least continued 20 years. We do not know what is the ratio of the Hittite population which got lost because of this epidemic, because textual records in this period is only given the perspective of the capital, given the perspective of the kings and queens. So we do not hear that much of the voice of the normal populations. So probably if the king is that afraid, the societies, the populations are heavily suffering from this epidemic. So I'll give the decision to you. Either I am just framing a very pessimistic portrait or not, but Eva von Dassault, who recently wrote an article, and I also put the link in your Word document as well. She says 20 years is about a generation. So in 20 years we have our kids, like if a baby is now newly born, 20 years he or she like will be 20 years old, like quite a long amount of time. So 20 years is about a generation, enough time for immune resistance to develop among successive age cohorts. That will be how it will take us to deal with the SARS, maybe. So I'll leave the decision to you, but it seems to us that we are going to be dealing with this COVID virus maybe a longer time than we expect, or I don't know, either we have to be waiting for other viruses as well or not. And thank you, and stay safe.
Thank you, Goncha. That was also very interesting. And like I said, I have questions, but I'll wait till the end and we can discuss those in more detail. But thank you very much. Davide, I believe you are.
Yes, that's me. That's me. So I made a handout that is in the Google folder as well, with some of these sources that I will be talking. I will talk about plague in classical mythology, plague in the Greek and Roman world, and then a little bit in the early Middle Ages. So here, can you see my?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So this is one of these artistic representation of the plague in modern age. This is the plague in an ancient city. It seems that it's a Greek city. We don't know exactly which ancient plague these Dutch painters was referring. So before starting with the Greek mythology, Greek history, and Roman history, I want to clarify a little bit some of the terminology. I have to confess that it's a little bit confusing reading about plague in the Greek and Roman sources, because according to many scholars, the first outbreak of plague was the Justinianic plague, so in late antiquity. But there are all these Greek and Latin and Roman authors who called any kind of infectious disease plague. So the Greek word here you can see it's loimos, but loimos means any deadly infection. So most of the translator, modern translator, rendered this word with plague, but it's not really correct defining as plague, because in English, in modern languages, plague, it's referring to a particular infection disease that is the bubonic or pneumonic plague. But all the plague that are in Greek and Roman source probably were other kind of disease. And from this word, loimos, there is, I think it's an archaic, in English, an archaic word that it's loimologia. Loimologia, basically it's the title of this treatise by Dr. Natalie and Hodges, who described the plague in London, and I suspect that it's an archaic medical terminology defining the study of the plague. The Latin word for plague was pestis, pestilentia. And from this we have, again, the Roman authors use pestis and pestilentia for infectious disease in general, also as a pest. The animal who infect plants, for example. From this we have the English pesticide, so came from this word. It could be also used in a metaphorical sense, especially in the Christian authors. Pestis, pestilentia, it's death, it's ruin, and very often it's a punishment like Murshilli, they died. It's a punishment of God. We will see that also Christian author consider this pestis loimos as a punishment of in this case, a Christian God. And then in the medieval Latin, there are these very strange definition, but this we know that are referring to the bubonic plague. So they call this infection disease pestis oclades inguinaria. It means basically it's inguinal plague, because one of the symptoms were the swelling in the groin area, or pestis glandularia, because it affected the gland. So the medieval texts are more precise, and we know for sure that is medieval author referring to the bubonic plague. So let's look at some mythology. So we have a god who is associated with plague, and in my handout that is in Google folder, I put this passage from Homer, the beginning of the Iliad. Everything starts with a plague. So Apollo descended from Mount Olympus with his bow and arrows, and for 9 days he shot his arrows and killed many animals in the Greek camp, many heroes. So it is an attribute of Apollo. So the arrows and the god who can cause plague. These are two representations of Apollo. This is a myth of Niobe. This is a famous marble, Roman marble statue. It's called Apollo of Belvedere. As you can see, now the bow and the arrow are missing, but as you can see, the god is depicted as a standing archer who just shot an arrow. Remember Apollo, because I will return to him when I will talk about a Christian saint also became the patron of against them, a protector from the plague, who is also connected with arrows. So for now, remember that the arrows are the instruments, the tools through which the gods, the Olympian gods, Apollo, who caused the loimos, it is this disease. Then we have one of the most famous episodes in Greek history, but also in the ancient world, is the so-called Plague of Athens. Again, the terminology, it's not correct. It seemed that it was not bubonic plague, but all the authors used this word loimos. There are many hypotheses about what was this infection disease. Here, if you see in the slides, I put some of the hypotheses: typhoid fever, smallpox. Even recently, I read some scholar hypothesized that this disease was Ebola. Someone else think about ergot poisoning. Other think about this disease that I have confessed I never heard, glanders. It's a zoonotic disease who affect mostly horse and mule, but can be transmitted to human. And other scholars believe that there probably was multiple diseases who happened in this short time. We have one of the best account in Greek literature about this infectious disease, that is Thucydides, in the second book of the Peloponnesian War. Thanks to Thucydides, we know that this outbreak of this mysterious disease happened in the second year of the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was this war between Sparta and Athens. The situation was pretty dramatic because the Athenians were all inside the walls of the city. So basically they were the ideal condition for the spreading of infectious disease. Probably thousands of people in a limited area inside the walls with limited probably food supply, limited water supply. So all these infection diseases spread and cause many dead. One of the most famous people who was the victim of this plague was Pericles, so the leader of Athens. He died during the first wave. We have also, it seems, I mean, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm an historian, but it seems that archaeologists found evidence of this infectious disease. I think it was in 1998, in 2008, they found this skull and the bones of an 11 years old girl that they called Myrtis. And I don't know how they date that it is remain to 430s. 430 is the year where this infectious disease, this plague, appear in Athens. It seems that from the analysis, the osteological analysis, this girl was died for typhoid fever. So some scholars believe that then the plague or described by Thucydides was this disease, this infection, so typhoid fever. And here you have a reconstruction of the appearance of this Greek girl. So these are probably a teenager girl in the 5th century. Athens was look alike. A few things about this account of Thucydides. So this is also another text that is in the handout. It's in the section B. It's Thucydides. It's very precise in describing all these symptoms. There are a lot of gross details. So if you are whoever is interested in these gross details, vomiting, dark blood, can read the description of Thucydides. But the point here is that Thucydides, it's very precise because he got that is infection disease and he recovered. So he was able to describe by personal experience. Also, in these periods in Athens, started the medical literature. Hippocrates was a few decades earlier than Thucydides. So probably Thucydides knew the medical terminology, used the Hippocratic language. So that's why it's so precise, even if it's not a doctor. Thucydides was not a doctor, but he definitely was very familiar with the language of Hippocrates and with his early medical literature. So this is, by the way, the most important case of an infection disease in the Greek world. And the description of Thucydides became a very important literary topos that was used by later historian and writer. We will see later Procopius. Procopius describing the first outbreak of bubonic plague. We use a lot of words, a lot of expression from Thucydides. So now let's move to the Roman world. We know that there were many outbreaks of infectious diseases in the Roman world. Here I will focus only on the most important, the most famous, the most important, and the one who impacted mostly the Roman Empire, the so-called Antonine Plague. This Antonine Plague is also known as a Galen Plague. I will explain why Galen Plague in a few minutes. It's named Antonine for the name of the emperor, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. This was the complete name of what we know as Marcus Aurelius. Here you will see this emperor. You have Marcus Aurelius, is co-regent Lucius Verus, and the adoptive father of the two Antoninus Pius. Marcus Aurelius, I think it's one of the most famous Roman emperor. I mean, if you ever watched The Gladiator, probably you know about Marcus Aurelius, his evil son Commodus. So at least it's famous from Hollywood. So this Antonine Plague, there is a huge scholarly debate about this plague. according to some scholars, had a devastating impact on the Roman Empire. Some scholars believe that the decline of Roman Empire started with this plague. There were a lot of problems. I mean, after this plague, we saw that the emperors struggled a lot. There was a lot of social turmoil. The population of the Roman Empire shrunk. The army, there were problems with the listing of fresh slaves. So there was an impact, but lately this impact has been kind of reduced. It was impacted, but definitely didn't cause the decline of the Roman Empire. Again, for this plague, so the author using the sources to talk about this infectious disease use the word pestis, pestilentia, but was not bubonic plague. Probably was smallpox. Some other scholars believe that were measles. And it started in the Middle East. It started during a war, the Parthian War. Was this war? Here you have a map. It is the map of the Roman Empire. So the Parthian War was this war fought between the Romans and their big enemies were the Parthian. The Parthian basically were the Persian, who established this empire in what is today Iran. So this war was fought along Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is where today it's in Iraq. So the Roman soldier, some Roman soldier got infected in Iraq, and then when all this army went back to Italy, basically they spread this disease all over the empire. Again, Gonja was talking about 20 years. This disease last, the first outbreak was in 165, and there were several waves. The last waves was in 180, so 15 years. But then we have also sources who talk about a relapse in 189. So these are 65 and 89 are 24 years. And this source that is also in my handout, it's the number 7 in section C. He says that every day in Rome there were, so this is the number that he gives, but some of these numbers are exaggerated. He said that 2,000 persons died in Rome in a single day. So that's a lot, So, but this tells that it was a big event. The mortality rate, it seems that it was pretty high. I'm not comfortable in giving all these numbers because we don't know exact number, but some historians, some scholars believe that 1/3 of the population of the Roman Empire was wiped out. So I don't know. I mean, but it's 24 years of this infection disease, so probably it's likely. And then also for linking again to Gonja about the religious aspect of this plague, there are later sources who linked this infection to the wrath of God. In particular, there is a source, Paulus Orosius, that is number 6 in the handout. Basically, he talks about a Christian persecution that was unleashed by Marcus Aurelius. And then he says, after this persecution, there was this outbreak of the plague. So it seems that it's making a connection between persecution against the Christian and the plague. So basically, according to Orosius implies that this plague was sent for punishing the Roman emperor for persecuting the Christians. So we will see this kind of narrative later in the other plague in the Byzantine world, where usually the plague is always connected with the wrath of God. Now, I want to now to move to the other big pandemic. This is in the early Middle Ages, in the during the Byzantine Empire. It seems that these infectious diseases that appears in the Eastern Mediterranean in 541 AD was the first plague pandemic. So this seems to be the first known pandemic of bubonic plague. In the history of our history, in the history of mankind, there were other two pandemics of bubonic plague. The second pandemic, I think Julia will talk later about the second pandemic. It's what we know as the Black Death. And then there was the third pandemic. It was more recently, was in the second half of the 1800s, and affected China and Southeast Asia. So these were the three, it seems there were the three known plague. Here with plague, I mean bubonic plague. We are sure that here it's the plague in the history of in the history of mankind. Even if I read that recently, but I'm not an archaeologist, and I don't know how these studies are reliable or not. I read that there were traces of human remains found from the Neolithic periods, found in Scandinavia, where there is they were able to trace Yersinia pestis. So in this case, it will be an evidence of the pathogen who caused bubonic plague in the Neolithic. But this is a pretty recent discovery, so I don't know if they will do more research, more studies, but traditionally the first pandemic, the first bubonic plague happened at the time of Emperor Justinian. So let's look here. So the origin of this bubonic plague, China, Central Asia, we don't know exactly which part of Asia first appeared this plague, but then through maritime trade, it reached first Egypt, and then Egypt, it reached Istanbul, Constantinople, where we have the account of Procopius, and from Constantinople, it reached all over the Byzantine Empire. So I have a more detailed map. So it seems that at some point, it is a plague in 540 reached Pelusium, that is modern Egypt. So this was the first location where this bubonic plague was detected. Then from Pelusium, with all this trade, maritime and land trade, it spread into direction, one towards Jerusalem, Antioch, and then the Caucasus. Another one went to Alexandria, then from Alexandria to Constantinople, and from Constantinople, basically all over the Mediterranean. Italy, France, even as far as England, Spain, North Africa, so all the Mediterranean. Gonja, you talk about 20 years of the plague of the Hittite. This plague lasted 200 years. So the first outbreak was here in Pelusium in 540. The last known outbreak of this plague was in Nepal. It seems that it's dated to 766. So it's 226 years. So a lot. It seems that there were 18, I think, yeah, no. Okay, there are 18 waves of this plague. There was the Justinianic in 542, 544, then later in the 6th, in the 7th. So there were waves, outbreak of this disease, basically every. I think the average was every 10, 20 years in different parts of the world, of the Mediterranean world. I put together some sources here, so you will see all the account from Procopius, who described this plague, the havoc that it caused in Constantinople. Basically, Emperor Justinian put Constantinople in, he shut down basically the cities. The situation was pretty bad. There is a lot of information in the Procopius you can read in this handout. Then we have many other later author who talk about all these waves. For example, I put one and source, it is a Chronicle of Zucnin. The Chronicle of Zucnin report the plague of Constantinople, but also give a lot of information about a later outbreak here in this part, in the Middle East. And then we have a lot of information about Italy and about France. About France, we have a lot of material from this author who is called Gregory of Tours, and from Italy, instead, we have information from this author that Julia, I'm sure you know this author is called Paul the Deacon. That is the main source for the history of the Lombard. I mean, in this handout, there is all these details about how the plague. Gregory was from Clermont-Ferrand, so he described the situation here, basically say, oh, there was a good bishop in the city, so God spared this city because he prayed so hard, so God spared this city, but in the other city there was an evil bishop, he didn't pray too hard, so that city was affected. So this kind of religious connection, and the same happened. Actually, I forgot to mention this, but it's one of the sources that I put in my handout. It's about happening during the Antonine Plague. Basically, during this Antonine Plague, there was an I mean, it's defined by the sources as a charlatan, like a false prophet. His name was Alexander of Abonoteichus. This Alexander basically was selling a verse as a charm against the plague. And basically, this verse was Apollo, keep off the plague from my house. So the people believe that this verse would protect them from the plague, so they inscribe in their doorway, and they didn't do any social distancing. They start to party. They don't take any kind of precaution against them. This infection disease, and they died. In fact, the source is Lucian of Samosata say it's very ironic that all these houses with all these verse are now empty because all the people died. So basically, it's kind of the same thing when you have this bad suggestion, bad advice. I mean, recently there was someone who suggested to inject disinfectant as a cure for the COVID-19. So it's not much different. Here you have a verse with Apollo, someone else, it's suggesting something else. But you see, it's the same kind. It seems that mankind is the same. So there are the same problem in dealing with the plague. And then I'm the last thing, and then I will let you, Julia, talk more about this plague in the Middle Ages. There is a Christian saint that is the protector from the plague. And this saint is Saint Sebastian. I put in this handout, there is the story how this saint became the protector from the plague. It's the passage by Paulus Diaconus. And it's really interesting that this saint became a protector from the plague because it's usually represented with arrows. So again, this connection, arrows, plague. And we have the story of this martyrdom. It's very, I mean, all this story of this martyr are very, I would say, very gory. There is a lot of gory detail about how this martyr was killed. We know that at first he was tied up to a tree, and the Roman soldier shot several arrows, but then he resuscitated, then he was tormented more, he died the second time, then he resuscitated the third time until he finally died. I think he was decapitated, something like this. So this saint, the history of this saint, the story of this saint, it's someone who suffered a lot, but then recover. So that's how the plague. So the people recover. And also how this saint was martyrized with arrows. Like, remember Apollo, who was shooting arrows down from Mount Olympus. So there is, again, in the Middle Ages, it is a connection between arrows and plague. This was an overview on the first bubonic, first plague pandemic. I think now Julia will tell us more about the second plague pandemic. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Davide. Okay, I will share. Sorry, share screen. Oh. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Everything's good.
Okay, so thank you, Davide. Yes, what I'm going to talk to you about in the next few minutes is the second pandemic of plague first, and then I'm going to talk you through which are the evidence of plague that we can find in the archaeological record and how the archaeological record can inform us about pandemic and epidemics. Now, the second wave of plague is probably better known as the Black Death that happened in the mid-14th century. Now, there are controversy about the name, why it is called Black Death, but probably it is because it is a mistranslation from in English or Swedish. Oh, sorry. Is it everything all right?
We just can't see you.
Ah, okay. Sorry. Okay, can you see me now?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
I was saying that it's probably is a mistranslation from English or Swedish, of the Latin expression atra mors. The term atra means both terrible and black. So probably when it was, and mors means death. So probably when it was translated, the translation black was preferred. Now we know that this term wasn't used during the epidemic, during the pandemic, but it's something that started to emerge in the following centuries and became very popular in the 19th century. So that's probably the origin of the term. The pandemic originated in Central Asia, from where it moved westwards following the trade routes. And it is believed that Crimea was the place where this disease coming from the east met with the Europeans. Now, it is not clear which was the events, probably were several events that led the merchants that were doing their business and living in Crimea to then sail to Europe and bring with them in their ship the disease. There is, though, an event that is quite well known, and is the siege of the city of Kaffa, which was a Genoese colony that got attacked by the Tatars during those years. And at one point, the Tatars' troops were struck by the plague, the plague. So what they decided to do was to throw inside the city with the catapult the bodies of the people who died. So although the Genoese tried to be quick in disposing of the bodies in the sea, probably this was one of the ways in which the disease reached the Europeans. And then the Genoese left the city, escaped, and probably brought the disease with them. So basically, between 1347, 1348, the disease arrived first in the Mediterranean ports through these merchant ships, and then from there it spread all around Europe. And it is the sort of peak of the pandemic is between 1347 and 1351. There has been relapses in the following centuries, as we've seen also with the Justinian plague, and it is believed that it killed almost 1/3 of European population, if not even half of it. Again, the numbers are not sure, but it was very deadly and very rapid in the spread. Today we know that the pandemic was caused by the bacillus of the bacillus called Yersinia pestis. We're going to talk about it a bit more later. And basically this bacillus is transmitted to the human through the fleas of the mice. The Black Death that was probably included three types of plagues. The Bubonic Plague that we've talked about a little bit already, and was probably the most common, and it attacks the lymphatic system, producing the swelling of the lymph nodes, so the buboes, so that's why it's called bubonic. And other symptoms are the fever, vomit, headache, diarrhea, and the text also report delirium. And bad smell from the victims, and dark blotches on the skin. The death occurred in this kind of plague. The death occur in between 2 and 6 days from the first infection. The pneumonic plague is then the next more dangerous, and it was less common during the Black Death, but probably still there. And in this case, the bacillus attacks the lungs, and so the main symptom is the coughing of blood. One of the problems with this type of plague is that it spreads through the coughing. So we know even nowadays how coughing can be a problem. and the person who gets infected by this kind of plague can die in 1 to 3 days. And then there is the most lethal of all, which is the septicemic plague that affects the blood. In that case, the hands and feet becomes black, and probably this is the responsible of the death that in the text are recorded as people going to bed and then not waking up in the morning so much, because this was a very quick way of dying. Of course, at the time they didn't have all the knowledge, the scientific knowledge that we have today. So the many causes were given to the disease. The main one was the bad air that sort of went around Europe and spread the disease around. And the reason because of this, for this bad hair were different. Somebody thought it was like a bad combination of planets. Others talked about earthquakes. But even in this case, as we've seen for centuries, it was believed, especially among the Christians, that it was a punishment from God. So what happened is that lots of superstitions came out, and also religious groups, such as the Brotherhood of the Flagellants, which were this group of people who toured around Europe, flagellating themselves publicly to sort of to pay for the sins of the world, including those sins that caused the plague, the pandemic. There was also the need to find scapegoats, and during the Black Death, the people who had the worst side of it were the Jews, who stories went around that the Jews poisoned the water, wells and springs with the disease. So they were victims of episodes of very strong violence and discrimination all around Europe. Despite all of this, doctors tried to cure the disease in various ways. They suggested emetics and also letting the blood out, which were remedies that were popular in the Middle Ages anyway, to get rid of the bad fluids in the body. And another remedy that was suggested was to burn scented wood. And funnily enough, these things might actually have saved Pope Clement VI's life, because he spent the time sitting between two big fires, burning this wood, and he actually survived. But probably he didn't survive because of the scented wood, but he survived because the heat from the fire didn't attract the mice, so he couldn't get the fleas from the mice. Some cities took the measurements that have become very familiar to us today. In Venice, for example, everyone who came from the east had to quarantine. In Florence, people who committed small crimes were released from prison to avoid overcrowding. Social gatherings were banned, like weddings and gambling. And funerals were restricted to immediate family. Lots of trades of business suffered, of course, of this situation. One example is the masonry work, the construction sector, as we've seen also today in our experience. For example, the Cathedral of Siena stopped to be built because there weren't masons left to build it. They all died. So we have several written sources that talks about the Black Death. One of these is the introduction to Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, in which there is a description, a very detailed description of the plague. And Giovanni Boccaccio's work is actually a collection of novels, and he used the narrative idea of the plague to bring this group of young people in the countryside outside Florence. And while these people are waiting for the pandemic to pass, they tell each other novels. And this is the framework of his work. But today I don't want to focus too much on the written sources, rather on the archaeological evidence that we have of the Black Death and other pandemics. We've already discussed with Bouland how the the funerary sources are a good way to get information about illnesses, and this is true also for past epidemics, and it could happen either through the study of the skeletons or through the study of the way in which people were buried. As Bouland has already discussed, only certain disease leaves traces on the skeletons, so are visible on the remains that we uncovered during our archaeological excavations. Unfortunately, the bubonic plague is not one of those diseases that leaves traces on the skeletons, because the period between the infection and the death is so short that there isn't time to affect the skeletons at all. So what can we use to infer, to hypothesize if a person was buried, died because of the Black Death? For decades, the main evidence were the type of burials, usually burials that were multiple or looked at like they were done in a hurry or in an emergency situation, not respecting the normal procedure for burying the death. And most of all, this is the case of mass graves. Of course, this kind of evidence can be also related to the chronology that can be obtained from the finds finds excavated on the sites, or through scientific method like the radiocarbon dating. And if the dates match with one of the pandemic, then it is quite likely that the burial is can be related to that event. Otherwise, another very valuable way is crossing the archaeological data with the historical sources when they are available. This is the example of East Smithfield Cemetery in London, because we know this is again a cemetery in London that we know from the written sources was established in anticipation of the arrival of the pandemic in 1349, and it was used only for the period of the epidemics. It has been excavated in the 1980s, and it is estimated that it contains more or less 2,400 deceased, of which around 600 were recovered. And it was composed of trenches and that hosted multiple burials, but also single graves. And the bodies were buried following the Christian tradition, so with the head placed at westward and the feet at east. They were prone and extended, and it looks there was some care and respect was used to bury this deceased. Among this group of people, it has been recognized signs of malnutrition occurred during their childhood. And this is interesting because it led to hypothesize that some of these individuals who died in their young adulthood probably suffered as children, suffered the famine that hit England between 1313 and 1317. So not very lucky people. So in this case, in the case of East Smithfield Cemetery, we are very lucky because archaeological evidence intertwined very well with the written sources, so we can be pretty sure that actually we are dealing with a cemetery that in which victims of the bubonic plague of the mid 14th century were buried, but in other case we don't have this richness of evidence. So which are the other way that we can use? Fortunately, in recent years, scholars have been able to obtain parts of the DNA of the plague bacterium from the bones that are excavated during our archaeological excavation. And once the DNA is detected, the DNA of the bacterium is detected in a skeleton of an individual, we can hypothesize that that individual was affected by the plague. The first step that has allowed this type of analysis has been the discovery of the Bacillus of the bubonic plague that has been done more than a century ago during what Davide said was the third pandemic of plague that happened in China first and then spread in the East. I mean, Europe wasn't really affected by it, but it arrived in the US, this third wave. And the plague became known to the world in 1894 when there was the outbreak in Hong Kong. And it is important to say that in the years before, it was the field of microbiology also was developing, in particular in two schools that were the School of Louis Pasteur in Paris, in France, and the School of Robert Koch in Berlin, in Germany. So as soon as the disease, the pandemic exploded and became known to the world, the two students of Pasteur and Koch went to Hong Kong to research the virus, and they managed to isolate it and identify it. And the bacteria was called Yersinia pestis after Alexander Yersin, which was one of the two. After that, also the first vaccine was found, and another colleague of the scholars who discovered the bacterium made the connection more clear between the fleas, the mice, and the humans. But for our purpose, like the breakthrough has been the publication in the 1990s of the results of the analysis, DNA analysis on, oh God, sorry. Don't know what happened. Sorry. Where were we? Here. Okay, sorry for this. The publication of the results of the DNA analysis on a group of skeletons from the plague stroke Marseille more recently, and they found Yersinia pestis in the extracting DNA from the teeth of the skeletons, and so they saw that they could actually detect it from ancient remains. Then from that point onwards, various analyses have been performed on samples dated to that related to the different plagues, both the Justinian and the Black Death. These kind of analyses have been performed also at this cemetery that is Thornton Abbey, again in England. This cemetery has been published quite recently, this research, and actually very recently, and it's important because it's the first rural mass grave related to the Black Death found in England, because we know quite a lot about the impact of the Black Death in the cities. We know a lot about London, but we know a little less about rural communities, especially thinking that one of the suggestions to escape the plague was going in the countryside. So it feels like the countryside was a safe place. It wasn't, because there are evidence of people dying there too. This site has been excavated by the University of Sheffield, and this abbey that was was in use between 1139 and 1539. And in the territory of the abbey, between 2013 and 2014, archaeologists discovered a mass grave. And both radiocarbon dating and finds suggest that this mass grave belonged to the 14th century. So they start to hypothesize that actually it belongs to, was dug to bury Black Death victims. This was confirmed also by the DNA analysis on 16 individuals. And again, we can see here, as we discussed before for the cemetery in London, that although it was a mass grave, there was care in the way in which the individuals were buried. And probably they were wrapped in shrouds, and they were disposed in a single layer and in 8 rows. And interestingly enough, this mass grave contains both male and female. So it is hypothesized that it's not necessarily the place of burial of the monks living in the abbey. So probably it's mass graves for the lay people, even if it is inside the abbey ground. And the reason why this may be, again, an hypothesis put forward by the excavators, is that it is possible that in that place there was a hospital that actually took care of the burial of these people. The hospital might have been managed by the monks. And this is suggested by the presence of a chapel that has been identified as a possible, the chapel of St. James, that is mentioned in a written source. So now the next point I would like to briefly address to conclude my survey is, once we identified individuals that have died because of the Black Death, or cemetery that are related with the Black Death or with other pandemics, what other information we can get from archaeology. And one is demographical information. If we compare the cemeteries that we identified as belonging to pandemic or epidemic episodes, and we compare them to the normal, to the cemeteries, the normal cemeteries, the everyday cemeteries, it is possible to compare the death rate of male and females and the age of death to see if the epidemics actually killed indiscriminately all the population, or were selective, or they affected part of the population more than, like, the elderly or people who had other conditions. In fact, actually studying the skeletons, again, as Bulan has shown, we can also know if the people who died of this kind of diseases had other health condition, if they left traces on the bones. We can see what kind of diet they were having. In some cases, again, if there are traces on the bone, which was their occupation in life, and gather information on their social position. So to see how the pandemic impacted on different human categories. It is possible also to see how to compare the condition of the population who died because of a pandemic with the condition of the population before and after, to see if actually there was the pandemic could be linked to a decrease in the health of the people before it actually struck, if it caused an increase in an improvement in the health condition after it actually struck. We can have information on how people reacted to pandemics. We've seen in the two cemeteries I presented that despite the urgency, despite the emergency, despite the fear that people who were infected caused amongst the living, they were still taking care of the burials. They weren't just throwing bodies and disposing of them casually. Through the DNA analysis, we can look at the origin and the development of the pathogen. This is something that, for example, has been done for the Justinian plague. At the moment, there is a research project going on undertaken by Harvard University and the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Germany. And they're actually taking samples from cemeteries that are probably from the Justinian plague period, all across the Mediterranean, and they found not only that this plague arrived in England, which was not known before, but also that what arrived in England was probably related to the Bacillus, the type of Bacillus that was in Egypt. So actually, that there was a link that in England it arrived through trade from the Mediterranean rather than across Europe. And they're basically, to use the words of one of the leading scholars in the research, they are hoping to identify a family tree of contagion organized by time, space, and the genomic characteristics of the plague. Then, I mean, Bülent already talked about this. It is possible through archaeology to investigate the climate conditions in which the pandemic developed. And, oh, again, sorry. I'm not really used to this. Okay. And through the zoological studies, so through the study of animal remains, we can have more information about those animals that acted as vectors for the disease. And then again, I won't go into much detail about it because Bülent has talked about it already, but other aspects of society can be considered and how they affected the development of the disease, such as the way in which settlements were organized, what type of infrastructure there were, the density of the population, and so on and so forth. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for another interesting presentation. So I want to tell our listeners that there are some very interesting connections between these 4 segments about plagues in the ancient world with some of our other modules. And some of the modules I would recommend connected to this include one on the science of disease, which talks and has some very interesting connections with what you all spoke about vectors and how things spread. So if you want the scientific aspect of that to put next to the historical and archaeological evidence, I recommend that one. There's also one, a module with a novelist who talks about the arrival of cholera in England in the 1830s. But there's some very interesting aspects of that that also tie into some of the things that you all have been talking about. I've learned an enormous amount in this hour of conversation. And I find this all very interesting, and there are additional resources in the module. There's a couple things maybe to draw these things together. I'm particularly interested in the climate aspects that Bülent had mentioned, and how the rise of cities sort of happened at the same time of climate change that impacted that. And we see still today, I mean, man-made climate change, but we still see today the difference in how this disease, COVID-19, seems to be impacting cities versus more sparsely populated areas differently. I don't know that, I don't want to put you on the spot to give us lessons from the past about today, but I find that sort of fascinating. And I wonder if humans have evolved to presume that cities equals bad and disease and the country is somehow good. And if that has deeper roots than what I had imagined it did.
No, exactly. Actually, when we look at the first cities dealing with two major problems, one, health problems related to climate change, sudden climate change, or as we call it, the rapid climate change, RCC events. So cities were fighting against those, and cities were also fighting against anthropogenic causes of environmental change, like land degradation, deforestation. These two factors actually impacted the first cities in a very short period of time, maybe in 30, 40 years. And and of course, at the time of the first cities, we have the writing system. So based on the textual evidence that we have, we see two opposing views. One is the view relayed from the governors, tied to the central administration in charge of administering their cities on behalf of these kings or emperors, whomever, queens, and they were basically saying that, we are we are in a hard place. We cannot really sustain our resources, and we have been losing people to diseases and famine. So in that context, you have to really imagine the Dust Bowl situation in 1920s and 30s, right? There's really not much going on. They cannot really produce enough, and they've been hit by extreme weather events and so on. And then central administration, on the other hand, is just portraying a picture-perfect scene, and this is, again, it goes to the fact that central administration would like to keep status quo for their own benefit, because obviously central administration is the one that benefits the most from intensive production. And they are not doing the hard work; they are basically reaping the benefits of it. But when I look at the current situation and climate-wise or disease-wise, when I look at the current situation and think about the past, the experiences of all these people from different segments of society, I'm not surprised. It's just striking to me that how much things stay the same. Because with all the technology, you would assume that okay, you can get better, you can do better, you would be wiser, but no, that's unfortunately no.
That's, I think, my biggest takeaway from organizing this class is how little we have actually evolved socially as a species. I mean, whether it's the ancient world, the Hittite world, the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, cholera in the British Empire, we haven't changed. I mean,
No.
No.
I don't know if that's hopeful or pessimistic, going back to what Gonja was saying, but it's just fascinating to me. And I found it fascinating how the relationship between plagues and its punishment from the gods, or it's the king's fault, or we've broken a social contract or something like that. It reminds me of some of the ruins in southern Mexico in the Mayan area, where they cut off the hands and faces of the statues of the kings because the kings weren't solving the problem as intermediaries with the divine, right? And I just find it so interesting that whether it's the Hittite Empire and Murshilli with his, God, you got to do something about this, or whether it's praying to Apollo or Saint Sebastian, or you know, whomever deity or saint to intercede because it's something else's fault, right? And that's happening now, still today. Back in the day, it was the Jews perhaps getting blamed for it. Now it's usually the homosexuals or the immigrants or, you know, brown people or black people. Like there's always somebody else to blame. And I find it sad that we have not evolved sort of as social creatures to understand things better and to work towards a better way of dealing with these things. I also found it interesting, both in terms of what all of you said, how disease tends to keep spreading for the same reasons. Empires building, warfare, resources, sieges. History just keeps repeating itself over and over. And I don't understand why we don't learn from that. Like, it's just, I'm just sort of mystified. Oh, and I also wanted to mention another module that it's in Spanish, but it's a module about the outbreak of cholera in Puerto Rico and the religious response. When medicine failed, how did religion respond to it? And I guess maybe a question for the four of you to sort of consider is what sort of social impacts and or memory did these diseases, these plagues have? In other words, once the plague died out, whether it took 20 years or 200 years, were there social structural changes in those societies as a result of the plague, or did we just forget about it and move on? And I'm asking this question for a couple of reasons. One, why does it keep repeating itself? But two, like when we look at more recent modern plagues like the flu pandemic or the AIDS pandemic, there tends to be a lack of cultural production to process it. Like once we dealt with it, we didn't want to think about it anymore because it was so horrible, and we move on. And I just wondered if in the historical or archaeological record, there's any evidence of deeper social or cultural change once a pandemic has run its course within a society.
I can answer a little bit about this. I obviously, for time reason, had to be brief. But when I mentioned the various measurements that cities were taken to contain the outbreak, on one hand, they were very different between cities, but we can see the beginning of a sort of awareness of public health in some of these places. In particular, there were some cities in Italy that established a special commission for health that then in the centuries became actually stable institutions that were responsible to look after the health of the city and like check the food, that the food was at certain standards. So during the Black Death, some of the measurements, especially regarding public health that were taken, actually lived on and developed and spread around Europe even more. So probably this was in, and there are studies I mentioned at the end of my talk about the fact that we can compare the health condition before and after the pandemic, and there are studies that suggest that overall there was an improvement in the health condition. We can't be sure it was because of the pandemic, but it looks like people were eating better, and I don't know how long-lasting were they, but.
Yeah, Goncha.
My response to that is, in terms of having a social memory and keeping the idea of epidemic, generally we don't have it. I think we forget. When it passes, everybody normalizes and we forget. That is what what I think about the epidemics. And I remember one of the phrases, I cannot remember who that was, but humans survive because they have the ability to forget, so that they do not carry the grief and sorrow, so they just forget. And when you are asking the question, I was trying to remember the 2014 talk of Obama, who is talking about the Ebola in Africa, and he's saying we shouldn't be forgetting that, and we have to act upon that. And look at now the situation, not only in the States, but globally. Did we learn something about the 2014 Ebola? No, because it was in Africa, it was far, far away. And at the beginning of this COVID virus, it was in China, it was far, far away. And look at the situation now. We globally are suffering from this pandemic. If it passes, I think we will be forgetting it in 5 years.
You know, there's actually an interesting event, or there's an interesting case that I can talk about just briefly, and actually it reflects Gonja's point at a larger scale. So the first temple that we can identify in southern Levant, in what is modern-day Israel and Jordan, is called Ein Gedi. This is a temple on the Israeli side of Jordan River, and it's currently located in a desert area. And it's probably, when it was built the first time, about 7,000 years ago or 6,500 years ago, it was about to become a desert, if not had already been a desert. And this temple is unique because there's really not a nearby settlement around this. It stands on top of a hill that overlooks the Dead Sea. It's a scenic place, but again, a desert environment. It's probably used by pastoralist groups that frequented the area because at the time of its construction, even then, agriculture was not possible around the area. So it's probably built by pastoralist groups for the use of pastoralist groups. It's a temple. It has a temenos, so it's a clear ritual structure. It's interesting that the entrance through the gate of the religious compound, there is a basin, and it was filled with water. So the message is that before you enter the religious compound, wash your feet. Make sure that your feet is clean. And again, this is important because from the start of the sedentary life, animals, domesticated animals, ovicabrids, cattle, stuff like that, they have been the basic agent for transmitting diseases. Okay, because we're not used to their system, but we live in close encounter with them. And so you go through the gates of the religious compound. You have to wash your feet, and before you enter the religious the temple structure itself, there's another basin that you have to wash yourself. So the message is clear that wash yourself before you enter and you practice your prayers. But what we see, on the other hand, in households, in settlements, is that there's clear lack of this clean water. We do not know where they were keeping their water. We do not know how they were preserving their water. And to me, this dichotomy shows that, yes, for certain practices, we understand the significance of cleanliness, but for a larger part of our lives, we can easily forget that. And even today, I mean, we're looking at our society, we're looking at other societies, you know, with all of the advantages that we have today, you know, technology, mass production, information exchange, you know, in a second or even less. we cannot stay at home. You know, after 3 weeks, people would like to go out and, you know, where are you going out? Going out to the movie theater? Going out to the shopping mall? I mean, what is it so urgent? So we can remember when we are required to do, but we can easily forget at the same time. So that's a problem.
Yeah, I feel like there's a conflict between sort of a cultural or social memory. We don't want to think about it because it was difficult in whatever way that it was. But yet there are institutional practices, whether it's the temple or the public health policies that Julia mentioned, but at the same time, we don't like them, or we reserve them only for certain spaces, going into the temple. Or, I mean, that's to me the most fascinating and disturbing aspect of current issues, where people don't want to wear masks or wear them around their neck, or wear them covering only their mouth but not their nose. Like, it's so, humans are just endlessly, frustratingly, fascinatingly curious to me. and yet we have all this evidence of what works, what doesn't, of societies dealing with them, and we just don't want to. And that's such a curious contradiction. Dowdy, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I am in the case, for example, of the Antonine Plague. I mean, I'm not sure if later generation were remembering that this plague, even if the historians were kept talking and writing about this plague. But one of the consequences of this plague, according to some scholars, for example, is the rise of Christianity. So religion, in this period, there was a lot of Eastern cult in Rome. So there was this need of spirituality. And Christianity at that point was one of the many spiritual sects. There was not an established religion. So even if the number of dead people, the events, the actual event of the plague were forgotten, but the change in the society lasted longer. Even if, I don't know if the Roman made the connection between the rise of Christianity, of the spread of Eastern cult with the plague. There are also some art historians also who say that even the Roman art change. For some archaeologists, art historians, the art of late antiquity started during Marcus Aurelius. So the figure, the sculpture became less classical. Basically, they art kind of start to lose that perfection of the classical time. So again, if this is a consequence, an impact of the plague, even if the people didn't remember the event of the plague, this change lasted. These changes affect the society, even if the people were not aware that they were a cause of the plague. I'm wondering, I don't know how will be our society in, I don't know, 10, 20 years, but do you think that this current pandemic won't leave any kind of change in our behavior, in our society? Well, what do you think? Even if we forget the actual pandemic, do you think that we will see changes that we not implicitly will connect with the pandemic? Question. I don't know how to answer this question.
I have an answer. I think that yes, but not around the pandemic per se. I think the pandemic created a social moment that allowed different protests to happen, because people were furloughed or unemployed we were in quarantine in some form. I think the pandemic has, at least in the United States, I can't speak outside the United States, but at least in the United States, has shown a more direct light on systemic problems that have already existed. And that was exacerbated with the killing of George Floyd and since then many others. And that gave rise to an opportunity for more sustained protests than this country has experienced in the past. Because there have been previous protests about police brutality and racism and so forth. But I sort of feel that the social results of the pandemic created a social space that was fertile for these kinds of other protests. And I feel that these things have sort of dovetailed and morphed into a new thing. And I think I see some of this happening in Mexico as well, where there's far fewer social safety nets. There's no unemployment insurance. They're not getting a stimulus check. And people have to go out just to live on a daily basis because there's no refrigeration for many people or no access to storage of food, things as Blunt mentioned from the very beginning of humanity. That I think that it has shown a light on social problems that have always been there, but are just exacerbated. And as a result, there is social movements to address them. Whether those social movements will have deeper and longer lasting consequences is something yet to be discovered. But hopefully there's some lessons from the past that even if we don't remember them, there may be some remnants of change that, as both Davide and Julia had mentioned, that maybe, I don't know, I'm trying to end this on a hopeful note here.
Basically, the pandemic is a kind of an opportunity for changes. It could be an opportunity for changes. I mean, it's happening for the Roman Empire, at least. Another example I can give you for the Roman Empire, immigration. The Roman Empire was totally ravaged by this pandemic. There were not Romans who can enlist in the army. So the emperor, starting with Marcus Aurelius, this is actually it's part of my dissertation, started to enroll barbarians. So they were also deported, forcibly deported immigrants within the Roman Empire. So all these settlement of immigrants, the barbarians were immigrants, so were resettled inside the Roman Empire because the Romans need farmers in these periods. Then in the 3rd century, there were a lot of land in Italy and the provinces, they were totally abandoned. So they need men labor, actually. They need the farmers, they need the soldiers. So, and you have all these people who were living outside the Roman Empire who entered the empire. And then, I mean, after 200 years, what we have is the creation of the barbaric kingdoms, I mean, much later. So by it, this pandemic probably put in motion a series of events that later on totally changed the structure of the Roman Empire. So hopefully will be the same with this pandemic, and we will have a better society in the future. Who knows?
Lancia does not seem too positive about that.
So, like, I don't know, like, looking from the perspective of, for example, now the issues with the George Floyd and the racism, we as the humans, we all have to learn from history. So look at 1940s, 50s, the Second World War. Did we learn something from that in terms of racism and stuff? Maybe limited. So we have to accumulate the knowledge from the history, from our own experiences, and should be more respectful for the next generations.
So in other words, study humanities, study archaeology.
Yeah, exactly. And wash your hands.
And wash your hands.
Cover your face.
Well, I really want to thank all of you for participating in this. I've learned a lot. I hope that our participants have found this equally enlightening. I also hope that this prompts people to read more and study more and learn more, and take the opportunity to take classes with all of my friends, but with these in particular. And it's great to see you. We do miss seeing you in person, but it is great to have the technology to still be able to connect with you. So stay safe, stay sane, and I hope that we can talk again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
So much for organizing.